Hi there. I thought today we'd try something a little different and just talk about some arranging techniques for groups of horns. Specifically today talking about what we call mechanical voicing techniques. Mechanical voicing techniques are really commonly used when we have a group of horns, let's say 4 or 5 horns. So maybe you're writing for a big band and you're trying to arrange the saxophone solely in the style of Duke Ellington or Count Basie. You'd be likely to be employing a fair amount of what we call mechanical voicing techniques. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some terms, some techniques, and some specific rules that we have when we're harmonizing a melody for a group of horns. So in order to get into it, let's first start talking about some mechanical voicing techniques. So if we assume that throughout this video today, we're going to be assuming that we're placing our melody in the trumpet because it's the best instrument. No, that's not right. We're assuming that we're putting the melody in the trumpet because it's the highest voice, and it's kind of the de facto choice we can make when we're arranging for a group of horns is placing the melody in the highest voice, but that doesn't always have to be the case, and there's plenty of other ways that we can do things, but that's kind of what we're assuming for today's purposes. And we're arranging for an ensemble of trumpet, alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, trombone, and bari saxophone, which is kind of a typical horn band format. If you go to Berklee College of Music like I did, then you'll find that this is kind of the instrumentation that a lot of the jazz arranging and composition classes are kind of built around before you start getting into more big band arranging situations. So what you'll see here is, first of all, this is what's called a four-way closed voicing. And what we mean by four-way closed is that we're starting from our top voice, and then we don't leave any space for any other chord tones between our voices. So you see what we have here is we have our 5 of this F major 7 in our lead voice. Well, then the next lower chord tone would be our 3, which we have placed in our alto saxophone, followed by the 1 in our tenor saxophone, and then the 7 in our trombone. And we call this four-way closed double lead, which means that we have doubled our lead down an octave. So you see that we have that C in our trumpet. We also have that C in our bari sax. This is really common to do when you're arranging a melody because it helps to give the melody a little bit more support and make sure that we're always hearing that. So a lot of the times when we're arranging for 5 horns, the 5th horn will be doubling the melody. Doesn't always have to be that way, and we'll see some ways where we won't be doing that, but that's a pretty common technique. So this is what that four-way closed doubled lead sounds like. Sounds great. We get a little bit of nice rub from the half step between the tenor saxophone and trombone. That's to be expected because it's an F major 7 chord where we're going to have that half step or major 7th interval kind of baked in. Next, we have a drop 2 doubled lead. So what we mean by drop 2 is that we had that four-way closed voicing, and then we took the second voice and we dropped it down an octave. So we took this A from the alto saxophone, put it down an octave, so it's now on the bottom of the voice, so it ends up in the bari saxophone. You'll notice that this has a little bit more of a spread to it, right, as we have this gap between our first and second voices. If we weren't doubling our lead here, there would also be a gap between our tenor saxophone and bari saxophone. So this is, we often will use drop 2 or these wider voicings if we want a little bit more of a wider texture to our horns. Also, we might use these kind of techniques if we're writing up higher, if our melody goes higher in the trumpet, high enough that it doesn't really make sense range-wise for the instruments below it in four-way closed, then we'd start using drop 2 in order to give those keep those lower voices in a more comfortable range. And we can hear what that drop 2 sounds like. Sounds great. Okay, next we have what's called a drop 3. I don't particularly use much drop 3. It's a great technique. I might use it sometimes, but I'm not usually choosing to write in long stretches of drop 3. It's useful sometimes if you're thinking about some counterpoint or something like that. But so what you'll see here is the same idea. Instead, we've taken our third voice and dropped that down an octave. So our root in the tenor saxophone is now in the baritone saxophone down an octave. What I kind of don't like about drop 3 personally is that it kind of has a little bit of a top-heavy structure, right? Sorry, it has a drop 3 tends to have a little bit of a top-heavy structure. You'll see that we don't have a gap between our first and second voice, where I personally like to have a gap, but then we do have a gap between our second and third voices. So I don't particularly like that spacing. That's kind of why I shy away from drop 3. Next, we have what's called drop 2 and 4. So this is kind of the biggest of our mechanical voicings. So you'll see that we still have that, what we've done here, if you look from our 4-way closed, is we've not only dropped our second voice down an octave, so you see this A is now on the trombone, we've also dropped our fourth voice down an octave, so this E is now in the baritone saxophone. You can hear what that sounds like. So you'll see that these techniques are kind of very specific, and if you just kind of make your decisions about mechanical voicings and kind of knowing what you're generally going to do, and you just follow some specific rules, you'll always end up with something that sounds pretty good. But there is still going to be some room for some choices that we can make in terms of taste and color and tone. So, for instance, we had this drop 2 and 4 here, right? Well, we have the 1 here in the second voice. Well, what we can do is, we generally are going to think of certain chord tones as not being that colorful, namely the 1 and the 5. And what we can often do is we can replace either the 1 or the 5 with extensions or altered extensions that allow for a little bit more color in our voicings. So for instance, here we have another version of this drop 2 and 4, where instead of having our 1 in the second voice, we've replaced our 1 with our 9. Sounds great. Something that also I particularly like, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this specific situation going forward when we get into our rules, but you notice that we had this minor 9th in this version of our voicing between the 7th and the 1. The minor 9th is a very dissonant interval. We don't necessarily, this version of it might be fine. We'll talk a little bit more about when it is not fine going forward. But by replacing this 1 with a 9, then we no longer have that minor 9 interval between the E and the F. And so we have a little bit more of a stable, but also more colorful voicing because we've introduced this extension into our voicing. So these are some examples of substituting an extension for one of those lower chord tones in our voicings. So here, to start with, we just have a very plain C7 voicing. This is drop 2, right? Doubled lead. Got the C in the trumpet and the trombone. It sounds like this. It sounds fine. Not very much color, but it sounds fine. And there's certainly certain situations where that's exactly the color you're going to want, right? But what we can do is, so first of all, here's an example where we're replacing the 5 in the alto saxophone with a 13. And that'll sound something like this. can hear how there's some extra color in there. Now we have this major seventh interval between the baritone saxophone and the alto saxophone, just creating a little bit more rub. We have a little bit more of an extension sound, so it's a little bit more colorful. Yeah. So now what we can also do, since we had that 1 doubled in the trombone, well, we can substitute that 1 for a 9, right? So now we have this 9 in our third voice, and that'll sound something like this. Even more color, okay? Finally, we can also experiment with alterations on those extensions. So here's a version where instead of having just a natural 9 in the trombone, now we have a flat 9 in the trombone, still that 13 in the second voice. It's a really strong diminished scale type of sound from this voicing that I really like. Finally, we could also have a flat 13 in our second voice. Instead of just a 13, we could have a flat 13. So this will be more of an altered sound with both the flat 9 and the flat 13. So, especially on dominant chords, experimenting with all of the different alterations and the extensions that we can use is really an important part of understanding arranging for a horn section. Getting to know these different colors, getting to know when the different alterations are appropriate is really an important step for a good composer or arranger. Just to kind of explain something, because maybe you could read between the lines when we were talking about replacing 1 and 5 with an extension, but if we're in a situation where we're harmonizing a melody that happens to be an extension, then I thought it's best that we kind of explain what we do in that situation. So you see here we have a G minor 7, and our melody happens to be the 11, which is a C natural, right? Well, what we were talking about before is that our extensions are usually going to be replacing lower chord tones. So because we have an 11 in the melody, we're going to assume that this is taking the place of the 5, right? So if this is a drop 2, right, drop 2 double lead, then we have this 11 here, which is taking the place of the 5. Below it would have been the minor third if it was closed position, but we're in open position. So now we have G next. All right, there's our 1, a flat 7, our doubled 11, and finally our flat 3 in the baritone saxophone. And this voicing will sound something like this. Sounds great. But something else that we can think about is when we have an extension in the melody, extensions tend to like to hang out with each other, right? If we have a 13 in the lead voice, then I'm almost always thinking, oh, maybe I want to have a 9 in the voice below it. So in this case, you'll see that we still have that 11 in the first voice, but what I've done is I've substituted the 1 in the second voice with a 9, and this sounds something like this. And this has this really rich, vibrant sound with a lot of color. I should also mention, you might be thinking, but we don't have the 1 anymore. Who's playing the 1? There's kind of an assumption in this kind of writing that I'm assuming that we have a rhythm section including a bass, and the bass is going to be holding down those bass notes, and that'll kind of be the source of that sound, which all of this arrangement will kind of be held in place by the bass notes played by that instrument. If you were arranging without a bass, then maybe we'd be doing things a little differently and treating these upper 4 voices as kind of their own unit, and our baritone sax would just be kind of dealing with playing the bass notes. Before we can go further into applying some of these techniques that we've been talking about for mechanical voicings, we have to learn a couple of rules that are going to help us to create certain sounds, to really be in the style of jazz for using these arranging techniques. So firstly, and this is kind of an important rule, is that we don't want to make the interval of a minor second or minor ninth between the melody and any lower voice. And the reason for this is that when we have a minor second, which is a very distant interval, or a minor ninth, it obscures the sound of the melody. So when you hear this, I don't really think that you're hearing this as our melody. In fact, I think you're more likely hearing the note below as the melody, because that's kind of what our ears gravitate more towards when we hear these dissonant intervals. Same thing for a minor ninth. Okay, and let's see how that sounds. So first of all, this is with that minor second between the top two voices. So you can hear there's that little rub between the top two voices. I don't dislike the rub, but in the situation where we're trying to harmonize a melody, that interval is going to detract from our ability to hear the melody itself. So in a case like this, where we have a root of a major seventh chord in the melody, what we're usually going to do is we're going to replace our major seven with a sixth. And that sounds something like this. Sounds great, sounds very stable. This is something that I think everyone should be kind of aware of, not just if you're arranging for horns, that a lot of the time if you're looking at a lead sheet and it says da-da-da major 7 and the melody note is the root, you don't actually want to voice with the root, right? Even if you're a piano player comping for someone and you get to the end of Miss Jones and someone plays, you don't really, I mean, maybe you want that rub with the one, that minor second between the 1 and the major 7, but in most typical situations in a jazz setting, it really makes more sense to place the 6 underneath the root rather than having that dissonance. Here you'll see a similar situation applied with a minor ninth, right? So instead of having a closed position voicing, this is like if we had a drop 2 voicing. Really, you can really hear how that minor ninth is making it hard to hear our melody clearly. But then here, and then comparing that with what is really kind of a 6-9 voicing, right? You can see that we have the 6 here, the 9, the 3, and the 5. So that's a first really important rule. The next rule is going to bring us into what we call approach reharmonization. So if you're following these rules for how we harmonize, the rules we were talking about before about how we harmonize extensions, and if you have a line that's moving in a linear way or kind of has some small intervals that you're trying to harmonize, you're often going to find that if you do things by the book, then you're going to end up with some really awkward line writing in your lower voices. Some people like that. Actually, something that always comes up is how if you've ever tried to play a third trumpet part in a Thad Jones chart, they are really not that much fun to play, because while the melody line moves in nice melodic expected ways, oftentimes the third trumpet part, the second tenor sax part, they tend to have some kind of awkward melodies. So there are people that disagree with what I'm about to say, but just so you know, this is kind of an accepted procedure when writing for groups of horns, is using what's called approach reharmonization. So the rule here is that we want to avoid awkward repeated notes in lower voices that don't mimic the lead voice, right? So if we have a lead voice that is repeating a note, then it seems completely natural that our lower voices will also be repeating notes. But you'll see here, we have this situation where we have a a melody moving up from 5 to 6 and back down. And if we were to harmonize this in the ways that we were talking about before, all of our other voices, except for our doubled trombone, are just holding on to a single chord tone, and it sounds something like this. Right? And I guess this wouldn't be that hard to play, but what you're noticing is that like it doesn't really support our melody in a very meaningful way. So you'd use what's called Diatonic Approach Reharmonization would be one option here. And you'll see what we're doing here is all of our voices are just moving up diatonically to the next voice, to the next diatonic note, right? And that'll sound something like this. You notice it sounds a little bit more appropriate for the way that our melody is moving. By the way, if you're writing out chord changes for the rhythm section, you don't need to mark these little eighth note approach reharmonizations into their part. It would probably do them more harm than good. But you'll see all we've done here is just moved up diatonically, mimicking the movement of our melody, hence diatonic approach reharmonization. Next, we have another example here. We have, if we try to harmonize this line, normally we end up with some really kind of awkward inner voices. It sounds like this. Right? When we have this in our top voice, it doesn't really make sense, right? So we can use now what we call dominant approach reharmonization. So that's where we're going to harmonize it, the passing tones here. So we can actually, if we were to, we could label these that this is these are both what we'd call passing tones, right? They're not our chord tones, they're our passing tones. PT for passing tones. Well, we can then reharmonize those passing tones, in this case, as our relative dominant chord to our current chord, right? So we're on a C7. So you can look down here, you see that these are all notes of a C7 chord, right? 1, 5, 3, 1, flat 7. Melody doubled in their trombone. Well, then for this D, we'll use notes of a G7 chord, right? Which is our 5 of C7. And so you see here, now we have our 9 of our G7, our flat 7 of our G7, our 5, and our natural third here, right? And we do something similar here coming down. And you can hear what this sounds like. Sounds much more appropriate. Yeah, it works a lot better than what we had before. And you can see how the bari sax actually has the most important thing here, where you see you have this, where now we're getting this kind of bebop scale looking line. Okay, next we have what's called diminished approach, right? So here's our starting awkward line, right? Won't get too much into that, but obviously that's kind of awkward in the way that the voices move. They're not really mimicking our top voice. Well, what we can do in this case is we can use diminished approach, which is using the relative diminished chord to our current chord, our 7 diminished chord. So we're on a D minor 6, so our 7 diminished would be a C sharp diminished, right? So you see what I've done here is I've harmonized all of these non-chord tones with that C sharp diminished. So we have here C sharp, G, E, C sharp, A sharp, B flat. I'm just calling it A sharp for ease of reading. And that'll sound something like this. Right? You can hear how that sounds so much more appropriate than our first version compared to, right? You could hear this in some old Benny Goodman style writing. This is kind of bizarre. Finally, we have what's called a chromatic approach, where you can reharmonize something with either a half step below or a half step above our target note. So in this case, this is really commonly necessary when we're dealing with like bebop melodies, like Charlie Parker heads or something like that, because he's using all of these chromatic approach tones. So chromatic approach reharmonization is going to be really great in those situations. So here's our little example that hasn't been done correctly, right? Even though in the melody we have this ba-bo-da, and now we just have these random, just in the middle, right? But instead what we can do is have all of our notes kind of follow that same shape as we approach our F7 in the third beat here, right? So everything is kind of starting a half step above, half step below, and approaching our chord tone. Sounds much more appropriate. This is what we call a double chromatic approach, where we're approaching from both a half step above and a half step below. So these approach reharmonizations are really important tools to be used whenever we're dealing with kind of awkward line writing, or if we have kind of linear lines coming out of our melodies. So now that we have some rules and tools, we can try to apply these mechanical voicing techniques to arranging a melody for a group of horns. So here we have the melody to a jazz standard. It's Ornithology by Charlie Parker, based on the chord progression to the song How High the Moon, if you're into that kind of thing. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to, assuming that the trumpet is going to continue having the melody here, we're going to harmonize this melody for 5 horns, okay, using the techniques that we've been talking about so far. So what I'm going to start with here is I'm going to be thinking about what are chord tones and what are going to be passing tones. And that's going to kind of save me some steps later on. That's why I'm kind of doing that ahead. So for instance, I see that our first note is this G, that's our 1, okay. That's going to be our chord tone. Well, we see a 9 here, but it's kind of going from 1 to 3. So I'm going to assume that this is more of a passing tone. Same for this C right here. This is a passing tone leading to our D. Well, D and B are both 5 and 3. Those are chord tones. Some kind of passing tones here on beat 4 and the of beat 4, and then we got 3-1 here, right? So we're kind of tending to be like chord tone, passing tone, chord tone, passing tone. So knowing that, I can just harmonize what are going to be the chord tones, okay? And to start with, I'm just going to assume we're going to do things with 4-way closed. Maybe later on we'll try to apply some wider voicings, like some drop 2, but for right now I think it's going to be best to just start with some 4-way closed. So as we talked about before, we have the 1 in the melody. So I think actually seeing the shape of this and knowing that we're kind of hanging out on the lower structures, not going too much into the upper structures of this melody, I think I'm going to tend to using, even though it says G major 7, I'm going to think of this as a G major 6 throughout. Because if you're familiar with Barry Harris's voicing techniques for the piano, they're very relevant also for arranging for horns. Specifically, what is his major 6 diminished scales. You'll see how those will become relevant pretty quickly. So we have our 1 here, has to be a 6 then, so we don't have a half step between the top 2 voices. 1, 6, 5, 3, doubled melody. You know what? And just to save myself a little time here, I'm just going to assume it's all going to be melody in the Barry sax, doubled at the octave here to start with. Okay, so we had our first beat there. 3, 1, 6, 5, 5, 3, 1, 6. Okay. this is another chord tone. 1, 6, 5, and then the and here, I was thinking, we'll get to those in a second. So we had, so now that we have some chord tones here, we just need our approach notes, right? And something you can always do is just start by writing in diatonic tones and see how those work, especially we have something like this where everything's just kind of moving up diatonically in our lead voice. So I'm just going to put our 7 here, leading from our 6 to our 1. Seems fine. And our 2 leading from our 1 to our 3. Okay, so here we see we have a D natural and an E natural on beat 2. Well, I can't really move diatonically, right? Because then that's going to lead to an awkward voicing. But I can move chromatically. And I already know that this is going to lead to that 6 diminished stuff that Barry Harris talks about. But it's also just what we'd call diminished approach reharmonization, right? So you can see if we put all of this in here, what we have here, A, F sharp, D sharp, C, we have an F sharp or D sharp or C or whatever you want to call it. We have a diminished chord that is approaching, right? And we'll move up further, and I'm going to do a similar thing here now in the trombone as we're moving up through the scale. And really quickly, let's harmonize this D. I'm going to assume this is like a D7 here, so I'm going to do a closed position. D7, 1, flat 7, 5, 3. Okay. Oops. Okay. Now let's listen to what that sounds like so far. Sounds fine. Nothing to write home about, but it works. And that's kind of the point of our mechanical voicing techniques, is they're easy and they work. Okay, so I see a C natural here. That tells me, you know, on a G major 7, our 4 is an avoid tone, so I'm going to kind of assume that I'm not going to actually harmonize this like it's a G major. I'm going to harmonize it probably something like a D7. So let's do that. So if there's a D7, flat 7, 5, 3... oh, that doesn't want to work. I could do an E natural here. Oh, wait, I could do this. Okay. So this is going to be, again, one of these diminished reharmonizations here. We have this F sharp diminished. And then we're just going to kind of follow the line. Right? Looks good. And then we have B, so that's our 3. Oops, not 16th notes. 1, 6, 5, and then 6, 5, 3. So this is our starting line here, just the first 2 measures of this melody. Right, sounds good. Everything is kosher. All of the lines are moving in a similar direction. They support our main melody well. They all move in the same direction. It worked fine. So moving forward here, just going to do my silly little shortcut so that I actually can do this kind of stuff quickly. I'm going to assume, let's move to some drop 2. And when I'm doing drop 2, I tend to have trombone in the lead, double the melody. So I'm going to do this here, down an octave, and let's do, okay. I'm going to get rid of these chords. So again, just harmonizing things down. Now I'm going to do drop 2 though. So we had G. So next down would be our flat 7 F natural, but instead I'm going to put our D here, and then our flat 3 in the tenor, and then finally looks like we'd have that flat 7 in the Barry. Let's explain this a little differently, because I know it seemed like I just kind of went through that kind of quick with that voicing. but let's think about it a different way. So we have B flat here, right? That's our flat 3 of our G minor 7. The next chord down from that would be the G natural, right? Well, we're doing a drop 2 voicing now. So instead of placing this in the alto sax, we're going to drop it down an octave, and it'll end up in the bari sax. Will be where that is, right? So the G there, then down a step from G, which would have been here, is the F natural. And then we'll have D natural here, R5, right? So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. I've done this a lot, so sometimes I kind of skip steps. I could, as you get to know these techniques pretty well, you can kind of read ahead and see what's going to happen. I'll try my best to slow down sometimes and make sure that everything's clear. Also, what you can start noticing is that you're just following the lines, right? So I see that I'm probably going to end up doing something kind of moving up, right? So we have the D here, B flat goes down in the bari sax, G, the root here in the alto saxophone, flat 7, F natural in the third voice. Okay. Here we're gonna, I assume this is also going to be a passing tone. So also this is on the and of 4. And something you should always ask yourself when you look at a melody is, does this and of 4 belong to the measure it's in, or does it belong to the next measure? Because oftentimes the and of 4 really, in my opinion, belongs more to the next measure than it does to itself. But in this case, since we're dealing with an F natural, which happens to be the avoid tone 4 of our 5-chord C7, then I'm going to still be thinking of this as a G minor 7 chord. So we have our flat 7 there. Next we have our B flat. Then we have our 1 here. And then finally we'll have our D natural here. Right, our 5. Okay, so now we just have to fill in our passing chords, right? And remember, you can always just look at, okay, what's the direction that we're heading in? What's diatonic? What's, what kind, does the diatonic work first of all? If the diatonic or dominant doesn't work, and what other options do we have? But so we have D here. Maybe we can get away with just going up to E, B flat, up to C, F, F. Okay, so we have F and G, so there's no space diatonically between them, but we could go chromatically. What does that give us? So this looks like a F sharp minor 7 flat 5. I guess that could work. Let's see what happens if we change this to a diminished, though. Let's see what this sounds first. Sounds nice. Let's try it with a flat 6. So that's the more that diminished sound. I kind of like it with the E natural in this case. So let's go with that. So let's keep going here. So again, we're gonna have that. We can't do a diatonic between the flat 7 and the 1. So we do a half step thing. Similar here. There's that E, and then a diatonic movement there. Just keep following. So a lot of the times what you're going to do when you're arranging a melody like this is just kind of following the line, trying your best to keep things diatonic. And if it doesn't work diatonically, then you start making some other decisions to try to fix whatever else is happening there. Okay. So let's keep moving here. I'm going to do something a little differently just to save myself some steps here. This is a way I like to do things when I'm trying to work quickly, is I just copy and paste everything in, and then I'll just work around that. It's just some shortcuts for you Sibelius users if you are trying to get things done quick and dirty. Okay, so I think I want to continue with drop 2 here, and I'm actually going to look ahead to this note. I see this long note, and I think it's a good opportunity to introduce some color into our chords. So let's say if I'm doing a drop 2, okay, drop the 2, that would be a G down into the bari, and there would be a 1 here, but I think because I want a little more color, I'm going to try it with a flat 9, okay? And then let's harmonize our other stuff leading up to that. So remember, starting from the back and working toward, so that you know where you're going, can often be a good move if you're trying to make sure that everything makes melodic sense. So let's see what that sounds like. Oh, I forgot some accidentals. We are in G major, by the way. Sounds fine. Okay, and let's, again, this is a case here where we have this D natural here, right? This, and I think this note is going to lead to some problems if I tackle it directly as a member of C7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in this F major first. And let's say that we're still drop 2, and maybe I can finally get a 9 in here for a little color. So we have 9, 5, 9, 7, 3. I have a feeling I can just put my 1 here. And then we have 9, 7, 5. Yeah. I didn't. Accidentals okay? Okay. So that looks good. Let's listen to what this whole section here sounds like. Oh, again, a little copy-paste magic, if you will. Because I think that this same chord should work fine there. Sounds great, right? Okay. Oh, I didn't do this part yet. So we're going to approach this, right? So it's a diatonic step above our melody note here. So I'm just going to make sure everything else does the same thing. Approach by a diatonic step above our target note, right? Where did that? There was some color in that I was not expecting. B flat, D, F. Oh, that's why. Watch your key signature when you're dealing with Sibelius, guys. Okay, so looking ahead here, I can already tell we're going to have some double chromatic approach reharmonization, right? We got this B flat, half step above this A, that's a third of our F major, half step below our third. So I think what's going to happen is I'm going to want to harmonize this note first. And range-wise, this is looking like we're better off back in our closed position voicings. So let's do that. And I'm going to do 6 chords. I just get the feeling like they're going to work better here. Oh, I'm kind of skipping some steps here, by the way. I'm kind of seeing that I'm going to want to, I can really quickly harmonize that last note there, right? Okay, so we have, so we want to go a half step above and below this chord, right? So that'll end up sounding like G flat major 6, E6 to F6, right? So just go a half step above, half step below, half step above, half step below our target tone. Oh, I didn't harmonize this right yet. Okay, and then, right, so we have all, it's this approach, these are approaching the third, approaching the 1, approaching the 6, approaching the 5, right, and doubled in the bari sax. And we didn't harmonize this note yet. Again, we have a 1 on a major 7th chord, so we're going to treat it like a 6 chord. So let's see what that sounds like, that last bit. Great, right? You can hear all of the voices kind of move in the same direction. It really is supporting the melody while keeping the overall harmonic color really clear. So let's listen to this whole example from the beginning. Okay, so that's one answer that we could get. Now, of course, you can find all kinds of other answers if you feel like using other voicing types, using other alterations to these chords. There's all kinds of different answers that you could come. But this is one answer, and it sounds perfectly fine. By the way, this was an answer sheet I had last night. Let's see if I came up with the same thing today. Looks like I used a couple of tensions in here in this version that I didn't use today, but it still works, okay? So I do want to show you something. So these whole mechanical voicings, they're really good for just getting a very basic, nice grouped sound out of a horn section. But they don't really allow for much individuality in the sound between the different horns. And if you were to look at some other more seasoned arrangers, you think of people like Gil Evans or Bob Brookmeyer, or certain times Duke Ellington, and what you'll often see is that they're not just thinking about our melody being that top voice, but they're also trying to create interesting counter melodies in the bottom voices. And one way that they sometimes accomplish that is by thinking about contrary motion, right? So what you'll see here, this is another variation that I wrote. This technique takes a little longer to do. It's not, this is the kind of thing I could, you can, with some practice, you can really bang out pretty quick. But when you're writing in a more counterpoint-oriented style, like this is, then you're going to find it takes a lot more trial and error, and you have to constantly be listening to things and trying to figure them out. But what we see here is, generally speaking, when our upper voice is moving up, I have my lower voice moving down. And then kind of the next closest voices are kind of following that same general shape, and then our middle voice is kind of meandering in the middle here, right? And what this is going to do is means that all of our voices are going to have interesting, unique lines, and when you put them all together, they're going to sound kind of awesome because there's all this variation happening, right? So for instance, we have, just as a point of comparison, right? I want to show you, so if you listen to this, our trumpet line by itself. Okay, it sounds great. Let's compare that to, say, our tenor saxophone line. Right? It has the same shape, right? We're moving up by a step, we're moving down by a step, everything follows similarly. Well, let's talk similarly now about this voice. So we already heard our melody line, but let's hear what the tenor saxophone sounds like in this example. Okay, completely different, right? And then let's listen to our bari sax, who is kind of the moving the complete opposite direction most of the time. Right? Okay, and then let's listen to what this version of harmonizing ornithology sounds like. So there's way more independence And I'd say that for me personally, I really prefer this kind of writing when I can hear it. Now, it takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more effort. It's a little harder to perform when you're writing, playing this kind of music. But I really think that now, of course, learning the mechanical voicing techniques is really important. And if you don't learn those first, then understanding how to write something like this will seem impossible. But I just want you to have a frame of reference for if you're learning about these mechanical voicing techniques, something else that you can be looking forward to that's a little bit more personal, a little bit more mentally intriguing in the future is just thinking about using these more contrapuntal lines and counterpoint writing in your harmonizations. Anyway, I hope that you learned something interesting from today's lesson on mechanical voicing techniques and arranging techniques for horns. And if you have any questions about today's video, please leave a comment down below, and I'll try my best to get back to you with any answers to any of your burning questions about arranging for horns. Also, I'm going to put this sheet up available on my website. The link is in the description below. Also on my website, there is a contact form if you're interested in private lessons, learning about jazz composition and arranging, improvisation, or the trumpet. So thank you very much. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.